are strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to Thee. Just a closer walk with Thee. Granted, Jesus is my plea. Daily walking close to Thee. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Through this world of toil and snares, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but Thee, dear Lord, none but Thee.
All right. So chapter 26 of the book of Leviticus opens up, "You shall not make for yourselves idols, nor shall you set up for yourselves an image or a sacred pillar, nor shall you place a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. You shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord." Now we got to start by breaking down. There's four categories of things that are mentioned here in verse 1. Potentially, we might see them as overlapping, and they are, but the very fact that he lists them individually tells us that he is making some distinctions, and some distinctions that are worth our being cognizant of. So we'll break down these four things. He first says idols. You shall not make for yourselves idols. This is the broadest term that's used in this verse. The singular form of it refers contemptuously to a false god. The word seems to carry the idea of something that is worthless or powerless or insubstantial. It is a replacement for God. Leviticus has already used this term. Leviticus 19 and verse 4, "Do not turn to idols to make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. I am the Lord your God." So idols identifies a religious category, and that's something we need to keep in mind. And we're going to see that that actually carries down through all of these things, though they may not in of themselves inherently carry that connotation. The context does. They are treated as gods, but they're nothing. They are not the living God. The terms that come after this describe particular kinds of objects that could be used for idolatrous purposes. Okay? So the next thing he says is, "Nor shall you set up for yourselves an image." Well, what's an image? Well, it comes from a word that means to carve or to hew or to cut. And so what we're talking about here is literally a carved or a graven image. The very thing that Exodus 20 and verse 4 had told them they should not make for themselves. It emphasizes a manufactured representation, something that they make, that they form, that they hew, that they shape, and that represents something else. What is the first graven image with these people that we're introduced to? The golden calf. Now, yeah, it just jumped out of the fire. All of their jewelry accidentally fell into the fire, and it just hopped out on its own. What did that image represent to them? According to the text, as it's presented to us in the story, the God that brought them out of Egypt. And so it was an image not of some invented God in their mind, but the God that delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. That was their representation of God. I'm not sure why they picked a calf. Have no idea. Egypt had a god with a bull head. It seems like they wouldn't want to create a god that's a younger, weaker version of that, but that's what it says they did. But that's what this is talking about, is this manufactured thing. You know, some translations say graven image here. The ESV just says image, which is a perfectly good translation. But the principle is that it's man produced, and that it is standing in the place or standing for something else. It represents something else. The third one is called here a sacred pillar in the ESV. This word pillar is very different from image. It comes from a word that's associated with standing or setting something upright, placing something upright. And so what we're talking about is essentially a standing stone or an erected pillar, some type of stack of stones, potentially even, that is raised up. And it's important, I think, that we realize that the pillar is not inherently an idol. That's not what's being suggested here at all. It's being distinguished from the idol, from the graven image. Jacob erected such a pillar in Bethel. What is that? Genesis 28:18. So early in the morning, Jacob took a stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar. So he kind of set it up. Think of it, in my mind, don't think of words engraved on it, but it's like a headstone. He just took this stone that he had used as his pillow, set it upright and stood it up where it could clearly be seen as something that was done intentionally, so that the spot would be marked where the things happened that happened that night.
It's more of a monument, like a
Yes.
that's where that originates from.
Um,
You see that stuff is not from the Old Testament. Sometimes even God
right. Which gets into something important in just a moment. We're going to point out. It happens again in Genesis 35:14. Uh, and that tells us, I think, something important about Leviticus 26:1. The prohibition can't mean any upright stone or commemorative monument is inherently sinful. It happened on multiple occasions. God said nothing about it. And as Greg pointed out, in some cases, he even told them to set up stones in this place. And so it's not anything that's intrinsically sinful. In this context, it concerns erecting such a pillar as an object associated with some type of prohibited worship. And we're going to see something else that I can't say for any certainty a little bit later in the chapter. I can't say for any certainty that this is absolutely the case, but I'm going to use the word likely or highly probable that there's a contrast. In fact, might as well do it now. I've said enough at this point. Notice he said to erect a pillar or to set up a pillar. Look over in verse 13 of the chapter. That's actually where I'm going to talk about it when we get down to verse 30. I think it is. Maybe it's tonight. I don't know. If I get to my notes again and it's there, I'll skip it. I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt so that you should not be their slaves. And I broke the bars of your yoke and made you walk erect. That word erect is the same idea as set up or erect a pillar. What he's saying here is, I don't want you to erect a pillar in honor of a God. God, I erected you so that you wouldn't have to bow down. And notice the language in back here in verse 1 again. To bow down to it eventually is where he goes to. I erected you so that you didn't have to bow down to others. I don't want you to erect something and then bow down to it. And so there's a wordplay kind of thing going on here. Don't you make something to subject yourself to. I raised you up from that. And part of how he erected them, how did he erect them? Well, he delivered them out of bondage. He delivered them from their enemies. He delivered them from the false gods. And so he said, I raised you up specifically so that you didn't have to subject yourself to these man-made things. So don't do it. So that's somewhat, I think, significant in wordplay that's going on in this chapter. Israel's explicitly commanded to destroy the pillars of the Canaanites in Deuteronomy 12 in verse 3, to knock them down. So this is probably best pictured not as a statue, but simply an upright sacred stone, in all likelihood a relatively simple thing, and likely uncarved. And so it's a very different thing than the graven image. It's just a monument. The fourth thing he mentions is a figured stone. This is probably the most difficult one to work through and figure out exactly what it's talking about. The stone part of it literally just means stone. So the important word is the word that qualifies it, figured, and it is associated elsewhere with imagery or representation or design or figured work. And so, well, Numbers 33 and verse 52, it says, destroy all their figured stones and destroy all their metal images and demolish all their high places. And so we've got these related categories kind of assembled together again in that place. It seems to be designating a stone upon which some carving or design or image has been placed, and it's distinguished from the previous one because of that. So the previous one has nothing engraved on it. This one has something engraved on it. There is some scholarly uncertainty over precisely what form these stones took. So I don't even pretend to know whether they are, and I'll go ahead and tell you, I lean toward this one, engraved stones. But they could have also just been carved reliefs. That was a very, very common thing. And it's interesting to me that they find a whole lot more carved reliefs in a lot of the other societies of that time and place than theirs. So it could have been reliefs, decorated stones along those lines, again, telling their stories and memorializing events in that fashion. We have a progression in this verse. So it goes from this broad category of idols to carved images, standing pillars, figured stones. And the material object itself doesn't seem to make any of these things inherently sinful. It's the next phrase, to bow down to it. So it's not setting up a stone or making a carved image. It's setting up a stone or making a carved image to bow down to it. Yes, sir.
Paul addresses this issue in different ways. When he went into the temple, he ate meat that was sacrificed for the idol. But he knew there was no such thing as that idol when he was hungry, so he ate. But he didn't want others to stumble because he ate meat at that temple, because they may have thought he was eating or bowing down and worshiping that idol where he got the meat from.
My favorite line in all that discussion is eat without asking any questions. So as we go through this, verse 2 becomes very important, and I read them together because of this. You shall keep my Sabbaths, and that is plural. And he had given them more than one. They had a weekly Sabbath. They also had a Sabbath to Sabbath, and they had all sorts of different Sabbaths, Sabbath for the land. And you shall keep my Sabbaths and reverence my sanctuary. I am the Lord. And so ultimately what's going on here is he is saying, don't confuse me with things that you set up and create. Listen, people do that still to this day. They invent religions and then slap God's name on them. And that's not his sanctuary. And all he's saying to them is, your reverence is to me, not to the work of your own hands, not to some God that you invent to replace me, not even to some image that you might make and say, this is our God, the God who delivered us out of Egypt. No, reverence my sanctuary. Who designed the sanctuary? God. Who designed the ark? God. Who said that the lid of the ark was the mercy seat and the place where God would dwell? God. Who made his presence known in the tabernacle? God. Understand, it's about God. It's not even about the tabernacle or about the ark. By the way, they made that mistake too. Many years later, they thought there was something special about the ark. And if they carried the ark out to battle with them, then they'd win the battle because God was going to get drug along whether he wanted to come or not. And that didn't work out for them so well. In fact, not only did they lose the battle, but they lost the ark. And then people took the ark, made the mistake of putting it in the temple with their God, and they lost their God. And then gave them the ark back. Because it was about God. And he said, I want you to reverence me. Later on in the New Testament, Jesus has to address the people and say, don't swear by the temple. That's reverence for that place rather than revering God. And he said, your reverence comes to me. I am the Lord. So Israel's forbidden to make idols and graven images. They're not to erect sacred pillars. They are not to, and it's all grounded in the Lord himself, for I'm the Lord your God. They're commanded to keep the Sabbath. They're to reverence his sanctuary, that is to respect his sanctuary. And we start getting, well, what God is doing here is returning their focus back to the most basic requirement of the covenant. The Lord alone is their God. Let's go. How do I have a relationship with God? I realize that God is God and there is no other. And I don't put anything, I don't make anything or erect anything in between me and God. I don't lift up a pillar and use that as a channel to God. I don't make an idol and use that as a channel to God. I don't make an image and think that that's going to be the way in which, no, I don't erect anything between me and God, because if I erect something between me and God, then I'm separating myself from God. And ironically, the closest thing to a mediator between them and God was what? Moses and Aaron. And they were both replaced with whom? Christ. They were actually simply models, stand-ins, shadows of the channel to God, which was God with us, God himself. And so he's laying the foundation for that way back here. You don't create something that stands in between us, because I am with you. And in fact, that's what Jesus ultimately ends up telling them, right? Lo, I am with you always, even until the end of the age. And so he's laying that foundation work all the way back here. All right, so the next segment starts in verse 3 and goes through verse 10. But before I do that, anybody have any questions about those things? Any, well, I think it causes the same problem for them that it caused for the Israelites. Anytime that we erect something in between us and God, then we're separating ourselves from God. Now, they didn't fall over dead immediately. If they did it, and neither do we, it's not something that can't be overcome. But what do we have to do in order to overcome it? Well, what did he tell them to do when they went into the land of the Canaanites? Knock down those things. So how do you overcome these types of idols, or monuments, or erections of man that represent God and God's ways rather than God himself? Well, you do away with them. Well, I mean, there's a lot of ways people do it, and the answer is yes, I have. But I have a problem with folks that use icons and crucifixes and all of those kinds of things, because I think it falls into this same type of an issue. We don't pray through those devices. We speak to the Father through Christ. So it's not a whole lot different. But you know what else is not a whole lot different? Any man-made system of religion. It's ultimately the same thing. The idea that you have to go to a man and make confession to a man who then is going to advocate for you for God. That is the same thing. Not the work of our hands necessarily, but it is placing someone in the shoes of God. I think that to call someone the vicar of Christ on earth is the same thing. They would disagree with me, but to me, it's the exact same thing to say that this human we're going to elevate and put him in the shoes and in the place of Christ until Christ comes back is not any different than what he's describing here. It's just a living person instead of being a carved image. So I mean, it happens a lot. Not what God told him to do. That's what I'm saying. He doesn't tell them what God told them to do. He tells them to make penance in other ways. Why? I don't know the answer to that question. I have no idea where he gets. I'm not even sure they do all the time. So I can't answer that question. I know that what God says is repent and pray that the intent of your heart may be forgiven you. And why they say to do anything other than repent and pray, I have no idea. Because that's the only instructions I find anywhere in the scripture. Go your way and sin no more. Stop. Just stop doing it and acknowledge that you did something wrong and ask God's forgiveness. That should be as far as that goes. And it's usually involves saying some number of Hail Marys and doing some other things. I don't even know what they all are. I don't have a clue. Yes, sir.
I know people gonna say something, but when he said sacred pillars, when we think of monuments, like you said earlier, it's not the monument, but it's the idol behind it, that whatever you believe in. But there are some monuments in this nation that people hold as sacred.
Sure.
And not the person, but the principle that that person or that people or those persons represented, they hold equal with God. And I believe that is on that same level. When you hold a document that man created and the monuments that go with those documents on the same level that we hold the Bible, I believe we on the same grounds that we.
Yeah. And I think you're very diplomatically avoiding saying in Washington, D.C. But I'm going to say it. So, yes. A few other places, but that's the main place. And listen, it's not wrong at all to have monuments and to build remembrances. It is wrong to elevate them to the divine and to hold them as something more than what they are. Listen, I am thoroughly impressed with the Declaration of Independence and with the Constitution of this nation. The guys that wrote those things make most of us look like we have pygmy brains. We're to use a literary term, we're Lilliputian in our cognition and awareness compared to those gentlemen. But they were not inspired, and it's not the Word of God. It's a human document, an important one, but a production of man. And so we have to keep that ever before us and in our mind. All right, so verses 3 through 10, he introduces the idea of obedience and what obedience, what the result of obedience is. Please understand, this is not a quid pro quo. This is not, if you will do what I tell you to do, then I'm going to do these things for you in a quid pro quo kind of arrangement. This is if you'll follow my instructions, this is the result. If you will walk in my statutes and keep my commandments so as to carry them out, then certain things are going to happen. Verse 4, I shall give you rains. The land's going to produce fruit. The trees are going to bear fruit. The harvest will be abundant. The threshing will last until the grape gathering. I don't know when the grape gathering was, but apparently that was a long time to be threshing and producing grain. And he was just saying you're going to produce grain all the way up until the time that it's time to harvest the grapes. The grape gathering is going to last until it's time to sow again. And so what he's actually describing there, and again, I don't know if this is intended to be literal, but what he's describing there is they will always be harvesting fruit. They'll always be producing. They're either going to be producing grain or producing grapes. And again, that's not all they produced. So I don't think this is intended to be taken literal. I think it's intended to have this encompassing idea of you are always going to be fruitful, not just short seasons of being fruitful. Israel will eat their food to the full, he says in verse 5. They'll live securely in their land. Now, these are all the things that we want. If you've heard of Maslow's hierarchy, these are the things that you worry about first. And if you don't have these things, then nothing else matters. They can live security in the land. The Lord will grant peace in the land. Boy, that's another one of those high items, is to be at peace. Yes.
When you're talking about like the continual harvesting, because the image in Revelation 2 about in heaven, about the trees that are always bearing fruit, always going to have that harvest, always that abundance coming from God.
That's a very good observation, and I don't think it's by accident. And I think they're ultimately conveying the same message, which is what? If you will do what I've asked you to do, this is going to be where you end up. This is the end of doing that. So when you ask questions like, why does God have us do this? The answer to that question is it so we can have peace and we can have prosperity, and not just material peace and prosperity, but peace to our souls and prosperity for our souls, so that we can have life and have it abundantly. Listen, not everybody who was a godly person was rich and powerful. And some godly people had terrible things happen to them, like they were stripped from their families and carried far distances and sold into slavery and thrown to the lions and into the fire pits, and all sorts of terrible things happened to them. In many cases, because they were godly. So this isn't a promise that they're never going to have any difficult times, but it's a promise that ultimately walking with God is equated with peace and security. Harmful beasts will be removed and the sword will not pass through the land. Israel will prevail over its enemies. And look at verse 9. So I will turn towards you and make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will confirm my covenant with you. And what he's saying is when you're living this way and you are prosperous and your families are large and you're fruitful in every way, what I want you to remember is this is a confirmation of my promises. Now, unfortunately, that is not always what prosperity did for them. In fact, what we see as the story plays out is very often when they were the most prosperous, what did they do? They forgot God and began to rely upon themselves. And it was so bad that if things started happening that were problematic, they didn't even necessarily turn back to God at that point. Sometimes they turned to the nations around them for help, even though he had specifically told them not to do that. And so he's telling them at the front, if you'll walk in my statutes and you'll obey me, this is what's going to happen. And I want you to know that that is the confirmation that my promise is true. That I am, in fact, doing what I said I was going to do, which again ends with, and in your seed, all nations will be blessed. I am working toward that end, just as I promised. Look at verse 10. You will eat the old supply and clear out the old because of the new. What does that mean? Yeah, you're going to have to eat extra to get the old stuff out of the way so you have room for the new stuff to be put. I think we need a bigger barn. The blessings are tied to obedience. Now, which is greater, the material or the spiritual? Spiritual is greater. So, what if it doesn't look like we're getting the blessings? Thank Job. Job was a righteous man. No one like him in all the earth. Job was so righteous, God used him as a bragging chip. When he sees the devil, he says, well, what you been doing? He says, well, I've been going to and fro the earth, looking to attack men. He says, well, did you consider Job? And Satan says, what? Well, of course I can't touch Job because you've blessed him so much. And so what does God do? He says, okay, if you think that's why Job is faithful to me, I'm going to let you do anything you want to him, except, and he puts some limits on him. And then he actually backs those limits off after a second conversation because the devil says, well, yeah, but you didn't let me touch him. You let me do things to the people around him and his stuff, but you didn't let me touch him. And he says, okay, go ahead and get him too. You just can't kill him. But short of killing him, have your way with it. What did Job do? He remained faithful. Why? Because he knew that it wasn't about material blessings. That wasn't primarily what it was about. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so that's an important lesson for us to learn, that when we read these kind of promises like this, don't get caught up in the material language. Understand the bigger lesson that's being taught. That obedience is connected to the blessings of God. All right, got to stop. Verse 11.
I am weak, but thou art strong. Jesus, keep me from all wrong. I'll be satisfied as long as I walk, dear Lord, close to thee. Just a closer walk with thee. Granted, Jesus is my